I'm Pauletta Hansel, and I am with the Urban Appalachian Community Coalition and part of our story gathering project. And I'm going to ask each of my guests, Emma and Susan, to say your name and also what neighborhood you're living in now. So Susan, would you start?
I'm Susan Carlson, and I live in Wyoming, Ohio.
And Emma?
And I'm Emma Bernay, and I live in Wyoming,
All right.
Ohio.
And I'll also just say, because I don't know if people can tell see your family resemblance from from our Zoom pictures, but Susan's the mom and Emma's the daughter. So that's that is this family connection here. It's always fun to be interviewing mother and daughter teams. We've done a few of those. So I also want to ask for each of you to tell me, and I'll just sort of combine this, sort of where you were born and where you grew up and what it was like for you growing up as a child. And either one of you should feel free to start with that.
Well, let's see. I was born in Clifton and on Bishop Street behind the zoo. And we moved to the suburb of Wyoming when I was 6 years old, and lived there with my parents and my brother, and in a big sort of old house with a scary attic. And I walked to school and played in the backyard. I got home and read a lot of books. It was a very pleasant, peaceful childhood.
So you kind of went, Emma, you sort of went urban to suburban, not quite rural, but urban to a little bit closer to kind of a rural living situation. Do you remember that transition from you're pretty young, but do you remember sort of how it felt to move from the city into the suburbs?
Yeah, I do remember some of it. I remember living down in Clifton, and I remember that we lived behind the zoo, and in the morning we could hear the gibbons calling. And I remember that I used to say that I was very young, that I could see my daddy's work from my window, which was at the time he was working at the VA hospital. And so those things meant a lot to me. And I remember living in kind of the small sort of brownstone arrangement that we had in Clifton. The houses were narrow and brick and close together and had sort of steep little yards with steps going up to them. And that our backyard was very small. My parents had a huge garden in the back. And that we had two women next door named Edith and Debbie, who were themselves Appalachian, and had a basset hound. His name was Bo. They sort of had heavier accents. They called him Boa, and it was boy, but it sounded like boa. And so we called him Bo. And he would bark, he had a big bark, and I liked him. And I thought he was great. We would sort of try to get up next to him through the chain link fence. Our backyard was really small, but to me it seemed really big. It seemed huge. My parents had a compost pile. They had a big garden, and there was a cherry tree at the back of the yard that belonged to the neighbors, but my parents were allowed to pick his cherries, his sour cherries. So they would put up a ladder and pick cherries to can. And when they did a lot of canning. And when they canned, they would use my great grandma Hutchinson's canning kettle, and she was one who had taught them how to pressure can. And so they did a lot of canning of their vegetable produce and the things that they would pick, like cherries. So I have a lot of memories actually from growing up down in Clifton. And that's what, when we were down there before I was 6.
Yeah, those early memories really do seem to stick, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
Well, how about you, Susan? Where were you born, and where did you grow up, and what was it like for you?
Well, I was born in Dayton, and my father was a child of an Appalachian family that moved up from West Virginia. My grandmother from West Virginia to work like in the factories. So my grandmother worked at Frigidaire, and my father and his brothers worked at NCR. So that was, that was part of that big migration north to the factories. And my grandmother, my father's side, worked, all of her really, like, I don't know, 20 or 30 years, at Frigidaire, and then retired there. So we were living near my father, that side of the family, that was the Appalachian side of the family. My other side of the family, my mother's side, was from Pennsylvania, and they were very proper. My grandma was a member of the DAR, that was a totally different side of the family. Let's just put it that way. The side of the family that my father's side, everyone adored my grandmother. She was a matriarch of the family, and definitely a kind-hearted woman who would make, I remember my grandmother would make green beans, and the Appalachian way, where they'd be cooking forever with ham. And as a child, I was very small, but I could not get enough of my grandmother's green beans. I would eat them and eat them, and I still, I can make them still, but since I don't eat a lot of meat, and they were pretty greasy, I could make them less greasy, and still, Emma liked them a lot, and our kids growing up. So my mother divorced my father when I was pretty young then, and so we left Dayton, and she remarried to a military family. So we traveled all over, and our life was very different. But when I was 15, I came back for a year to live with my grandmother, and again experienced that wonderful down-to-earth kindness. My grandmother only went to like the 6th grade, and she, worked all her life. My grandfather worked in coal mines, and I think she used to say his back was broken. I don't know what that means, but he was very stooped over and on disability. So he was kind of grumpy, I remember.
You might be too if your back was broken, right?
Maybe, yeah. So, but she was definitely the one running the show.
Interesting. And so how did you end up in Cincinnati?
Well, let's see. I was in graduate school in New York City in social work, and I wanted to live in a big city, a city.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to live in a city that had a lot of arts in it because I like art a lot. And I wanted to be near some of my family, and and it was easy to get to my grandmother. She was in Ohio. My parents were in Colorado. And so they were a lot further away and not living in a very interesting place. So I decided that Cincinnati would be an interesting place that had a lot of arts, and I could drive and see my grandmother. So I flew into Cincinnati and got a job.
That's great. That's great. So I want to follow up on one other thing with you, Susan, and then we'll also kind of open it up and talk more about Emma's experience of her grandparents and great grandparents. But so Emma talked about you all, you and your husband having a big garden and composting. Is that what you experienced as a child? Did your grandmother or your mother have a garden in Dayton?
Let's see. My grandmother did not have a garden. It was a very urban place, and she was, working all the time.
Where'd she get her beans then?
Paulette, don't you know you start out with canned beans?
See, I wait till the half runners are available at the farmer's market.
But my mother, not due to my grandmother, was a huge gardener and always had a garden, but that was something from her upbringing in Pennsylvania. But my grandmother along that line was the one that taught us to can tomatoes and showed us how, my husband and I. So so she definitely knew about the canning. she, tried to keep us safe by saying, now, you don't go for all those other vegetables that are not really acidic because you're not advanced enough.
Yeah, so she carried that knowledge with her. And so Emma, how about you? Did you have a relationship with your West Virginia side of your family? Did you ever visit West Virginia?
Yeah. So my great grandmother, my mother's grandmother, Grandma Hutchinson, died when I was about 8. So I do remember her. I don't remember a lot of parts because I was really young, but I remember her, and I actually very vaguely remember some of her sisters. She had 3 sisters, Ethel, her name was Alva, Ethel, Opal, and Gertrude. Those were the 4 sisters. So I remember a couple of, I can't remember which ones, but there would be a couple other old ladies sort of around. I do remember going to visit her in Huntington, where she had moved by the time I was around. We would go pretty frequently, at least my memory, it's a few times a year, enough so that I remember the drive. And that she lived in Huntington in a house, a little bungalow that had a street that was still paved in brick. And I remember that made a big impression on me as a child. I had never seen a street paved in brick, and that was the only one I ever saw back then. So this would have been like the early 80s. And I don't remember a lot about her. I remember she was like real heavy set, and so she was kind of like a sit down a lot. She was like, kind of would wear big sort of flowered dresses, and she was sort of smiley and white haired and had glasses and was sort of a comfortable, friendly person, and that people, my mother would be happy to see her. There was sort of a general feeling of like ease and comfort, and if this was somewhere you go, it would be nice. And so those are, my memories aren't real strong of her because I was really young. Most of my memories of her are made up of my mother's stories about her.
Right.
So that's where a lot of my memories are sort of my memories, not really memories, come from. But yeah, I do remember, and I know she has come to our house, but a lot of the stories about her are sort of, they're like apocryphal stories about when she came and then this happened and when so-and-so did this and, what she was like. And my father, who's from a totally different background, really loved her and liked to tell stories about his experiences with her. So that was sort of her presence in my life, was these stories.
Do you have one of those stories that you could tell?
Well, let's see. I remember a couple that my parents would tell. One was that one thing about her that my parents always like to know, she was a very earthy, kind of real person, and not bothered by a lot, probably because she had seen a lot in her life by the time I was around. That she came to see me when I was a baby, and it was going to be a big deal because it was my mother, very close, and her, first great grandchild, and all, not the first one, but a big deal, and she came to see us in Clifton and sat and held me, and I pooped all over her arms because I was a baby and wearing a diaper. And that she just laughed and thought that was the funniest thing ever, and just like got up and wash your arms off, and just thought that was hilarious because that was the kind of person she was, that liked to laugh and wasn't bothered by something like that. So I always thought that was a great story when I was growing up. That's hilarious myself, The other story that I remember my dad liked to tell was that his background, he is Jewish, and so that's how our family's Jewish. And one aspect is not unique to Judaism, but was unique to his background, was that he felt like some of his religious upbringing was kind of stiff, kind of like just kind of formal and not real, so not a lot of feelings involved. He himself as a person did not particularly care for that. He likes things that are not stiff. And he would like to tell a story she often told about how when he was a young man and he had just met my mother, they perhaps were just married, and they would go down to see Grandma Hutchinson, and she would always say grace before the dinner, because she was that was what she did. And he loved this grace so much. It was not a formal grace. It was just a simple grace. It was usually just asking something that she was thinking about for other people, or something that was, on her mind, or something that she thought people might need. But he felt like it was a very simple and sincere way of expressing yourself. And he just loved that. And he thought it was the ultimate expression of spirituality, and he just couldn't get enough of it. So that's another strong memory I have of her.
That's cool. Well, I also wanted to ask if if either or both of you or your parents and grandparents, Susan, did you use words like Appalachian or mountain people to describe who you were? Was that at all part of it?
I remember my great aunts, her sisters, when we were down there after she moved back to Huntington, sort of talking about people that were ridge runners, or I don't know if that was Tennessee or something, and sort of laughing about it. But I think that all seemed quite mysterious to me. I think my grandmother, in some ways, like, didn't want to associate with people that were, poor, or what she would view as, like, I mean, she wasn't a mean person or anything, but like, well, we're not going to refer to ourselves like that, So it was kind of a little bit of a joke, I guess. But no, she never. That wasn't part of her to refer to herself or others in that way. I'm guessing that's why, but that really wasn't a part of it. I just wanted to tag on to what Emma said about the saying the grace before the meals. It was my memory of my grandmother's. Emma's exactly right, that they were always very sincere. She's very religious that way. But when she said a prayer, it was like suddenly she was transformed into this, like, spiritual, like, I don't know, a priest or something. Like, she would take a different tone of voice, and it was very poetic, kind of like what we think of as in the Black church, she just would, pour this out and really be sincere, and we would all just sit there like, wow. It was like a poetry when she would give a prayer. Like, boy, now that's what you call a prayer there. We're talking a prayer. So,
wow. She felt the spirit.
She did. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and Emma, how about you? Because when we met, you identified yourself as having Appalachian roots. When did you start thinking about that as being part of your identity?
Well, that's interesting, Pauletta. I'm glad you asked that. But because growing up, it definitely was the awareness of like that Cincinnati was partially an Appalachian place and that part of my family was there, was definitely there, but I didn't have any words or awareness to identify it in that way. It was only later, looking back, that I realized how much of it I was surrounded by, even with our neighbors who had the dog, So I didn't really identify consciously in that way until I was older. I went to graduate school in Miami, and I took some Appalachian Studies classes. And I have a very distinct memory of riding a bus to Chicago to meet some friends and reading a book for one of my Appalachian Studies classes. And it was a book about urban Appalachia and Appalachia in general. And I had never heard of Appalachia, written about in an academic way. And I had these flashes of realization all along the way, this 6-hour bus ride. I read the book the whole way, that this was stuff I had been seeing and was familiar with my entire life. And here it was, somebody was identifying it for me. And so it was really like startling. And I actually thought at the end, I should switch my focus to Appalachian Studies, because this is really, really interesting. Didn't wind up doing that, but it was that interesting to me. And so after that, I sort of started being much more aware of, and by then I was ready for that because I was in my mid-20s, aware of, in a conscious way, of the Appalachian influences that I already knew, but I didn't, I just, when you're a child, you don't really think of things consciously. Kind of like my mother was saying about, do they speak of themselves as Appalachian? You just sort of like, just who you are, like, I don't know, Grandma Hutchinson, there she is, her brick street was pretty interesting. That was sort of where it began and ended. She just was, So it was much later, but it was very interesting to me.
So in thinking about that now, Emma and Susan, I'm going to ask you a similar question, and then we'll probably need to be wrapping up. But sort of thinking about that now and that background, and this is who, this is just who we are. Can you identify any ways where that background might have sort of helped create who you are now as a person, as a writer? Actually, Emma hasn't mentioned that she's a writer, but I happen to know that is what she does for a living. But do you have any sense of how that family history and family life might have helped shape what you decided to do with your life?
Well, I think for sure that my mother's huge influence on me in this area, because my mom's always identified, in my memory at least, as having, being connected to this part of the country and coming from there, and always spoke my whole life very positively of, Appalachia often comes in for a lot of negative talk from people everywhere. And my mother never always spoke positively and always really sort of pointed out to us the unique, special parts of Appalachia and what makes it special, what makes it unique, and the ways that people are there that sometimes they aren't other places, and always always is held up to me and my brother as something that's really, really, really cool and interesting. And so I always had positive associations, and it was only when I got out into the world more that I realized that most people don't have positive associations. They aren't from around here, or a lot of people don't. And that was always, so I always sort of like surprising to me. And then I would sort of feel like kind of defensive, like, well, actually, no, it's not like that. Or there are these positive things. So I think I've kind of carried that with me, even leaving the Cincinnati area as an adult for many years, and back as an adult. So I guess I just sort of took that positive association in, which is part of the reason as a writer, I chose to write a book about, part of Appalachia history that I was really interested in. And so I just sort of took that in and carried it around with me. And it always seemed, it always seemed like a positive.
Yeah, and for folks who are watching and listening, you can read more about Emma's book on the Urban Appalachian Community Coalition's blog. And Susan, how about you? I mean, you told us you were a social worker. Do you feel as if your upbringing had any relationship to making that career decision, or any reflection on how, growing up with a Appalachian migrant family might have helped shape your life?
I definitely think it helped shape my life in the sense of my mother was close to my grandmother, even after divorce. I mean, she stayed in touch with her. When I needed a place to go for a year, she sent me there to her. This was a warm and a welcoming side of my family. And my grandmother's family in Pennsylvania was not so easily accessed and warm, and I think so that there was this place where everything was easy and comfortable. I would say comfortable is a good word, and fun. So you felt safe, you felt it was fun there, and my grandmother would stand up for me no matter what. In the middle of any family conflict, she would always be on the side of what was right, not what looked good or whatever. So, she had a huge influence on me and in making me who I am. And I carry her inside me every day. So that part of me is, I don't know whether that has to do with me being a social worker or not, because I was pretty much I was always committed to that idea. But she definitely has influenced me to be the person that I am, and feels, safe and secure within myself.
Thank you so much. So Emma and Susan, is there anything else that you feel like you would like to say before we close this interview that I haven't had a chance to ask you?
Pauletta, we've just so enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you for putting together this project and for hosting us for this interview. It's been really special.
Thank you. It's been a delight.
Oh, thank you so much for that. I didn't get to mention that our great grandmother on my father's side was Drusilla Hatfield of the Hatfields and McCoys, although nobody's talked about it growing up, but my sister did family history and found out about it. So we thought that was sort of amusing. But at any rate, thank you so much for doing this. And I think that's a great project, and just be interested in seeing some of the other videos.
Great, thank you. So again, I'm Pauletta Hansel with the Urban Appalachian Community Coalition Story Gathering Project, and we thank Susan and Emma for their time and thank all of you for listening.